Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you everybody for coming to our September community night. We're very excited for this one. We have, mashallah, two awesome guest speakers. We have Ustadh Daniel Haqiqatjou. So, Ustadh Daniel was born in Houston, Texas. He comes from a liberal, secular Muslim background, but he recommitted himself to Islam in high school. He studied physics as an undergraduate at Harvard University and completed graduate studies in philosophy. He has also studied Islam traditionally with scholars. He has written and lectured on contemporary issues surrounding Muslims and modernity over the past 10 years, and has spoken at universities and mosques around the world. His writing can be found online at muslimskeptic.com. Also, we're blessed to have Shaykh Mustafa Umar. Small little introduction on him, inshallah. Shaykh Mustafa Umar was born and raised in Southern California. He holds a bachelor's degree in Islamic Studies from the European Institute of Islamic Sciences. He has a master's degree in Islamic Studies from the University of Gloucestershire. Did I say it right? Close. Gloucestershire, in the United Kingdom, as well as a bachelor's degree in Information and Computer Science from the University of California. He's traveled extensively and studied under scholars around the world, particularly at NWIIC in India and scholars from Azhar and Darul Uloom in Egypt. He has authored several books and has served as religious director at the King Fahd Mosque in Culver City, California, and the Imam and Associate Director of the Islamic Society of Colonial. He is currently the founder and director of California Islamic University, the Education and Outreach Director at the Islamic Institute of Orange County, and the Vice Chairman of the Islamic Shura Council of Southern California. So, thank you for bearing with me with the introductions. Alhamdulillah, we're very blessed to have Ustadh Daniel Haqiqatjou as well as Shaykh Mustafa Umar here with us. Inshallah, the topic for today is atheism and evolution. We understand that you're probably going to have a lot of questions. So like previous community nights, we have prepared the SlideView app or website if you'd like to go to it. So if you have any questions throughout the program, you can go to www.slido.com. That's www.slido.com. And the event number is V as in Victor 502. V502. So if you have any questions while they're speaking, they actually have it as well on their phone, so they will see the questions that are coming up. And you can like the question if somebody asked it before you, if you want it to be asked, inshallah. So without further ado, we will begin the program. Jazakallahu khairan.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Jazakallah khair, Ustadh Osama, for that generous introduction. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to speak with you and also be here with Shaykh Mustafa on these very important topics of atheism and evolution. Inshallah, I'll be giving you some thoughts on evolution, hopefully addressing some questions that people have on this topic, Muslims have on this topic, and then we'll transition to Shaykh Mustafa to get into atheism, and then we'll have a general Q&A. So please submit your questions through the app that Brother Osama mentioned. So explaining and talking about evolution in Islam is very difficult because it's a very involved, scientific, philosophical topic, and trying to boil it down into something that you can present in 40 minutes or an hour or even a whole 3 hours is very difficult to do. And so what I'm going to present, inshallah, are some broad brush thoughts on this And I thought that it would make sense to give you an analogy that'll help you understand my own understanding and feeling about the broader considerations and concerns about Islam and evolution. Because I think that this specific issue really touches on a much larger conflict and a much larger tension between Islam and Muslims on the one hand and the modern world on the other hand. And so if we can better understand how to address this smaller question of Islamic evolution in the right way, that will help us understand the bigger tension and the bigger conflict that Muslims need to address. Muslims as a community, our scholars, our intellectuals, and academics need to address. Why? Because the faith of our community is at stake. So many Muslims have doubts, shubuhat, about Islam, about the Quran, about hadith, and the statements of the Prophet ﷺ. So we have to be able to address these doubts and give intellectually compelling responses that meets the challenge that we've been presented by the modern world at large and modern ideologies such as scientism, naturalism, materialism, to name just a few. So this is what is at stake, the faith of our community and of our youth. So I thought that one way to really get across the tension is with an analogy. And I want to use the analogy of colonialism because that's something that many of you are aware of. This idea that there were colonial powers that came and essentially subjugated the Muslim world. They subjugated the Muslim world, and the entire colonial project was to get Muslims to abandon Islam, abandon their commitment to Islam, and adopt the colonial religion or the colonial power. In a nutshell, that was the colonial project. But in everywhere that the colonizers went in the Muslim world, and even outside the Muslim world, whether it was Egypt or Libya or Tunisia or Iran or Pakistan, the subcontinent, I mean, they had enablers. They had people who were part of those lands, Muslims, who cheerleaded the colonizers. And they were basically saying, look everyone, we should be happy about this colonization process because they're helping us, we're benefiting from their rule, we need to accept them, we need to get with their program, we need to follow their laws, we shouldn't oppose them. And even if it might seem like what they are doing is against our interests, even though it might seem like what they're doing is harming us, is oppressing us, is injustice against us, just ignore that. Just ignore that because it's just your imagination. In fact, the colonizers are helping us. So this group of people I call enablers. And some of them, I'm not saying were hypocrites in the sense that they knew that they were causing trouble and they knew that they were oppressing or enabling the oppression of Muslims. Some of them were sincere. They really did believe that European colonizing powers were going to improve the Muslim world. Okay, so they were not conscious of these conflicts, and they were not conscious of the fact that Muslims were being oppressed, and the Muslim mind was being oppressed. That Muslim thought, Islamic scholarship was being oppressed. Okay? So this is the analogy that I want you to keep in mind, and inshallah later I'm going to explain how this is relevant to Islam and science, and Islam and evolution. So before we get into some of the details of evolution, it's important to understand what does Islam say, and to what extent can we accept evolution? And when it comes to what Allah says and what the Prophet ﷺ says about human origins and the creation of mankind, it's very clear. Okay, the Quran and Hadith are crystal clear. There's no questioning what Allah says, that we have all been created from one male and one female. Like Allah says this in the Quran, Ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha. O mankind, indeed we created you all from one male and one female. It's very clear that we have Adam as our father and his spouse Hawa as our mother. Peace be upon them. And again, this is something that no scholar of history has questioned other than those who left the fold of Islam because of their deviance on this view. So, in today's world, you have many religions or religious traditions that say, who are Christian, Jewish, and they say, look, we have Genesis, we have the story of Adam and Eve, but this is all metaphor. This is not a reality. This is just allegory. We accept the theory of evolution, which says that all of life is on one family tree, and humanity has evolved from a prior species, and that the first human beings descended from a prior species. And in fact, humans and chimpanzees, humans and gorillas, humans and apes, we all have a common ancestor, meaning, again, we're all on the same family tree, we're cousins. And furthermore, humans and bears, humans and cats, humans and dogs. We're all cousins, evolutionary cousins, because we all have one common ancestor, and everything is on the same family tree. So, in response to this scientific theory, you had religious traditions who said, okay, well, the science says this, and there's no doubting science, there is no questioning science. We have to accept it for what it is. And the Bible says differently, well, we interpret the Bible metaphorically. Clearly, if we took it literally, that would be a mistake. Because the true history of humankind is what the scientists have described, what Charles Darwin has described. That's the reality. And then the religious texts, these are just metaphors, and people who interpret those texts literally are simply misinformed. They don't understand. As Muslims, however, it's not just in today's time that you have some calling that for Muslims to interpret the Quran metaphorically with regarding Adam, Isaiah, and many other things. But this has a past tradition. You have the falasifa, what were known as the philosophers within Islamic history, such as Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, Al-Farabi, and what characterized their thinking and their thought was that all of the Quran and Hadith that conflicts with reason should be interpreted metaphorically to such an extent that they, for example, denied that the universe was created. They denied that the universe had a beginning and an end, which is, again, a clear contradiction of what Allah says in the Quran. And they denied that heaven and hell are actual places, physical places. They denied miracles. And they did this because they saw conflict between what their rationalism, Greek rationalism, said, Aristotle and Plato and so forth, and what Revelation says. And so they prioritized the Greek thinking. And everything else, they said, this is just metaphor, these are just stories, these are just things that we can consider to be allegory. So we have that in our history, and the Muslim scholars of those times said that, look, people who think like this, like Ibn Sina, like Ibn Rushd, and so forth, the falasifa, the philosophers, they're outside of the fold of Islam. They're outside the fold of Islam because they deny what is clearly stated, clear-cut within the Quran and Sunnah. So that's something that we have to all be clear about. The question then becomes, well, given this orthodox Islamic position that all scholars within Islam accepted historically, doesn't this conflict with science? Doesn't this conflict with what scientists say about human origins? I mentioned the family tree and how science, the scientific consensus is that all species are related and that there wasn't a first human being that just came from nothing. No, the first human being had a father. The first human being had a mother of a different species, some ape-like species. So this is a clear, logical contradiction between what the Quran says and the Prophet ﷺ has said and what science is. Another big contradiction is that science, the scientific consensus is that at no point in human history was the human population less than about 3,000 people. At no point, historically, was the human population less than 3,000 members, meaning it's impossible that humanity descended from one male and one female who lived at the same time. This is the scientific consensus, and they come to that conclusion. How? By doing DNA analysis and mathematical modeling to determine what the human population was at different points in history. So, according to that consensus, and the many papers that have been written on this subject, human population couldn't have ever been two, Adam and Eve. That's scientifically impossible. So this is, again, a clear, direct, logical conflict. How do we understand this, and how do we reconcile this? So let me ask you all a question, and if you can just raise your hand. How many of you think that Islam and science can never conflict? How many of you think Islam and science can never conflict? So there's only two. So that means most of you think that Islam and science can conflict. Okay, so can you give me an example of that?
Or they're shy.
Huh?
Or they're shy.
Or you're shy, yeah, you don't want to out yourself. Most of you said that they can conflict. Islam and science can conflict. So what's an example? Obviously.
And not a specific example, but there are, so when you keep doing research, science evolves. But in Islam, there's a truth, absolute truth, which remains. For example, science one day says that drinking a lot of water is good. The other day it says that probably an optimal amount of water is good. So science keeps evolving, whereas Islam remains the truth. That's how I understand it.
MashaAllah, that's very good. So for those who didn't hear, the brother's response was, science evolves, science changes. One day they say you need to drink this much water to be healthy, 8 glasses a day. The next day they change their opinion. So if science is constantly evolving, we know that Islam is the truth, the constant truth. And so logically, there's bound to be conflict. You also had to raise your hand?
In terms of example, you might have mentioned this already, I can't read, but the hadith say that Adam and the previous people were very, very tall. And if you look at like what science says about hominids, they were shorter than human beings today. But obviously we know from Sahih hadith that Adam was so many cubits tall or whatever. Like what 50 something cubits, I don't remember. But
Right, so there's hadith that mentioned the height of Adam a.s. being much taller than what scientists claim is possible biologically, what's possible given the geological record. Yes, that's another good example. And I'll give you many more examples, but this was my conclusion as well, that yes, of course, science and Islam will conflict. And you often hear preachers and certain Muslims saying that Islam and science, they're always compatible and they always agree, and there's never going to be any point where they disagree. And this is something that is promoted. And the mentality or the idea behind it is that, well, science is the truth. Science is explaining and giving us knowledge about the way that the world really is. And Islam, Allah, the Quran, is giving us information and knowledge about the way the world really is. So there can never be any conflict between those two epistemologies, or those two avenues of knowledge, science and revelation. But what that argument misses is that revelation or science is something that is constantly in flux. Science is constantly evolving. Science is changing. And when I study the history of science and the philosophy of science, this is something that is acknowledged by everyone. You have different paradigms. You have different eras where certain ideas about the way the world works are surpassed and they are overthrown, and new theories and new ideas about the way the world works come about. A simple example is the transition from Aristotelian dynamics. So if you study Aristotle, this was the dominant understanding of nature prior to Isaac Newton, or prior to Galileo, is that you have 4 elements in the universe, like earth, fire, water, and the ether. And the reason that, if I drop my phone, it falls, is because my phone is made of earth, and this table is made of earth, and so those elements attract each other. So this is Aristotelian dynamics. Then you had Galileo, he had a different system. Then Isaac Newton comes, and he has a completely different system that does away with the elements that Aristotle discussed. And then after Isaac Newton, you have Albert Einstein. And Albert Einstein presents general relativity, relativistic mechanics, and so this is something that completely overturned Isaac Newton. What does this mean? It means that Isaac Newton was wrong. His understanding of the way that the world works was wrong. His model of, or picture of reality was wrong. Okay? So you have this constant change and flux within scientific history. Another example, the Greek philosophers maintained and believed that the universe had no beginning and has no end. The universe is eternal. And that was the rational conclusion and the consensus in many cultures that were influenced by Greek thought, including the Muslim philosophers, which I mentioned. But then, in the 20th century, you had the cosmologists within America and Europe saying that there was a Big Bang, and that yes, the universe has a beginning that started with the Big Bang, and the universe actually will have an end as well. And so this became the scientific consensus, that yes, the universe has a beginning and an end. And then after that, nowadays, the dominant view is that there is a multiverse. And in fact, the universe doesn't have, our visible universe has a beginning and perhaps an end, but the multiverse is eternal. So once again, the scientific consensus has changed. But all of these different views are mutually exclusive. They can't all be right, but they were all part of the scientific rational consensus. So of course Islam is going to conflict by logical necessity with at least one scientific position. So logically, there's got to be direct conflict between Islam and science. So how have Muslims dealt with this conflict historically? And now this is where that analogy with colonialism comes in. Because despite there being a direct conflict, we've just mentioned a few. The creativeness of the universe, the origin of mankind. In light of this direct conflict, you have people, non-Muslims, Muslims, who bow down to the authority of science. And they say, look, this is what is the scientific consensus, And it might seem like there is conflict, there might seem like this scientific model is contrary to Islam, is contrary to the Quran, but actually that's not the case. There is no conflict. Don't worry, just ignore it. Everything is fine. And this is their approach. This is their approach. This is kind of an avoidant approach, where you avoid the problem, you avoid the conflict, and you pretend like it doesn't exist. And there are many ways, specific ways that Muslims advocate. Some Muslims advocate this kind of avoidance today. For example, there's this idea that religion is only concerned with morality and spirituality, right and wrong, what happens in the afterlife. That's the domain of religion, and science, that's the domain of understanding the universe, doing observations, and basically understanding how the world and the physical universe works. So religion and science can never conflict because they're just about two different subjects. They're just about two different subjects. So this is one way of avoiding the conflict, but this is a terrible strategy. It makes no sense. Why? Because of course the Quran and Revelation in general is also about the world. Allah describes the world. Allah describes the way that the world works. Allah describes how the world was created. Allah describes different forces of nature, the patterns of weather, the motions of the stars and the planets. And these are all described by Allah in the Quran. So this idea that religion is only concerned with morality and has nothing to say about the physical world is false on a very cursory inspection or cursory reading of the Quran. Another kind of avoidance strategy that Muslims give, and some Muslim philosophers have given, is that we need to understand science as being what is true and what is indubitable, meaning can't be doubted, on the one hand, and then there's a lot of baggage. There's a lot of metaphysical and philosophical baggage. And as long as we reject the baggage and we ignore all of the metaphysics like naturalism and materialism, then we'll be fine. Then everything is peachy and great because we've preserved the fact that science is true and Islam is true. Just ignore the philosophical baggage. This is actually a very common approach and this common line of thought that you'll read in different papers that have been published recently. But this is, I think, a bad approach as well. It's not a very compelling approach because when we talked, remember what we said about the createdness versus eternality of the universe. Did the universe have a beginning or not? Or is it eternal? That's within the scientific consensus and the actual scientific papers that have been put out that will argue this based on empirical grounds, based on empirical research. Or, for example, the idea of a common ancestor and the evolutionary history of mankind, and the fact that the human population could never be as small as 2. Those are all within hard scientific papers, using mathematical analysis, using empirical observation, in order to draw those conclusions. It's hard to see, okay, where is the philosophy here? Where is the naturalism here? It seems like they're doing science faithfully without a bias. And so this shows that, okay, the conflict is actually deeper. We can't just avoid and ignore the conflict by saying, okay, this is just, we reject the naturalism, we reject the philosophical baggage, and we trust science. No, the actual science has conflicts and problems that we have to grapple with. Okay? So these are avoidance strategies, ignoring the conflict between science and Islam. And the results of this kind of approach is a loss of faith within the Muslim community. Because if we don't recognize that this problem exists, then we can't address it. And we can't realize the impact that it has on the way that Muslims understand themselves, they understand Allah, they understand the universe, they understand everything. If we put science on this pedestal and we consider it to be this perfect, infallible avenue of knowledge, then of course that's going to affect your iman. Of course it's going to affect how you understand other sources of knowledge, like the Quran, like the Sunnah. Because you can't really help how things unconsciously affect you, how things unconsciously affect your heart and mind. And we see this. We see a lot of, within the past 200 years, when the Muslim world has been introduced to Western science and technology, so much apostasy, meaning leaving Islam, so much loss of faith. Why does this happen? It's very obvious. People have taken science as the sole primary avenue of truth and understanding, or if they haven't taken it as the sole primary avenue of truth, they've said that this is the main, this is the strongest, this is the most powerful, the most accurate. Religion, on the other hand, revelation, on the other hand, this is something that, is for the uneducated, and, it's only about how you pray and how you fast, and all these scholars are, these mullahs, what are they good for? This is the kind of attitude that has been promoted within the Muslim world for over 200 years. Of course that's going to have an impact on Muslim faith, and of course that was part of the colonial project. Again, going back to this idea of how colonization made Muslims internalize inferiority, made us internalize this idea that science is the path to truth and knowledge, and religion is at best, revelation is at best, second hand, second class, can be ignored, and you don't need religion to understand the world even. Doesn't matter. We have science. So what's my approach? My approach is that we need to acknowledge the conflict. We need to acknowledge that Islam and science are in conflict. And this is, I think, apparent with, again, a very basic, cursory reading of the Quran. We read about so many things where Islam, where the Quran and Sunnah identify things about the world and about ourselves that science does not acknowledge. How many things? The Akhirah, the existence of Allah Himself, angels, jinn, barakah, okay, the barzakh. All of these aspects of the universe are not addressed or even acknowledged by science. The resurrection, the possibility that a body can be resurrected after death, completely outside of the understanding of science. All of the miracles, the mu'jizat of the anbiya, the prophets, bringing the dead back to life, splitting the moon, splitting the sea. All of these miracles completely outside the purview of science. And then here's where another avoidance strategy comes in. Because when these things are, you read them in the Quran, some say, oh, well, these are just from the ghaib. We understand that there's the ghaib and there's the shahada. The seen, the unseen is the ghaib, and the seen. And all of these things are the unseen. So again, there's a sharp division between the domain of science and then the domain of religion. Religion only is concerned with the ghaib, whereas science is about the shahada, the seen. But this is not an easy division to make, because many aspects of the ghaib we do and can experience in the world. One of the biggest or the main examples are the ayat of Allah. The ayat of Allah, the signs in creation, within creation and with ourselves. We see the signs of Allah, and what those do is they indicate, and they are evidence for, and they point us to the unavoidable, indubitable conclusion that Allah exists, and that He has created us, and we must worship Him. These are the signs that Allah is constantly pointing us to in the Quran and as well as the Sunnah of the Prophet. So this neat division between seen and unseen is not actually represented within the Quran and Sunnah. We do have evidence of Allah, the ayat of Allah. The other thing that we have to understand is that ghaib doesn't literally mean unseen, that no one has seen it. Because, for example, Allah sees everything. Allah sees everything, so nothing is technically unseen. But within Islamic theology, the unseen, the ghaib, has different levels. So there are some things that are unseen to the angels, but are seen by Allah. There are some things that are seen by the angels, but are not seen by the jinn. There are some things that are seen by angels and jinn, but not humanity. There are some things that are seen by believers. There are some things that are only seen by the Anbiya, but are not seen by non-believers. So there are different levels and layers of the ghaib. We can't just say that, okay, whatever is ghaib is outside empirical reality. We can never see it, we can never touch it, we can never do this and that. And again, there are many examples of things that are ghaib, but they still interact with the world as Allah describes. For example, the famous hadith of Jibreel alayhi salam, the angel Jibreel. He came in the form of a man to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Jibreel is from the ghaib, but he was seen. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam saw him, the Sahaba who were with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam saw him. Things like jinn. I mean, people have so many jinn stories. This is, technically the jinn are from the ghaib, but that doesn't mean it's impossible to see them or to see their influence. There was a really interesting article on possession, on people being possessed, and how there was one scientist who dedicated his entire life to studying possession, and his scientific conclusion, he was a psychiatrist, professional psychiatrist, his conclusion was that there's no natural explanation for possession. There's no way that we can explain this using scientific terms. This is definitely something beyond the empirical and beyond the scientific. And this is the conclusion that many have reached prior to, the advent of modern science. So, this is part of the conflict. Islam identifies many things that are a part of the universe, part of the world, that science does not acknowledge. And vice versa. There are things that science acknowledges that Islam does not recognize, of which I mentioned as it pertains to evolution, the creation of man. Evolutionary science says that humanity has biological predecessors. The first human being was born, whereas Islam says no. Allah says no. Adam was created from dust. Adam khuliqa min turab. Okay? It's very clear cut. No question about what Revelation says about the origins of Adam. And in fact, in the Quran, Allah compares the creation of Adam to the creation of Isa. Isa was created with no father. Adam was created without a father and a mother. So this completely contradicts the scientific consensus. And again, science acknowledges that humanity was never smaller than 3,000 in population. Very clear conflict. So how do we then, as Muslims, deal with this conflict? Because if you have put science on this pedestal and you view it as this something that can never fail, it's infallible, it has no problems, it's always accurate, then this is going to cause a crisis of faith. How do you deal with this conflict? And what we have to do is put science in its place. We have to recognize that science is often wrong. Science is more wrong than right, if you look at its history. It's very prone to error. And this makes sense, because if you think about human beings even, we have 5 senses, okay? But how do we know that our senses are capturing all that exists? Even from a purely empirical scientific perspective. Prior to the 20th century, or actually 19th century, prior to the 19th century, the scientific world had no idea about X-rays, had no idea about the electromagnetic field. That's a big part of the world around us. But science just had no clue. In fact, X-rays and the electromagnetic field were discovered by accident. If that accident hadn't happened, the scientific world still wouldn't have a clue about that very important aspect of reality. The problem with science is that it doesn't know what it doesn't know. And the way that I visualize this idea is think about science as a blind man, without any sense of sight, sense of hearing, sense of smell, just feeling around. Just feeling around. And whatever it happens to touch, oh, okay, the universe is a, bottle of water. The universe is, a rectangular solid shape. Whatever it is coming into contact with, then it extrapolates and it creates theories. This is how we should view science, as a blind man, rummaging in the dark. And if we look at the history of science, this makes sense. That's why you have so many changes in paradigms. You have so many different new theories that arise and other ones that fall out of favor. Another way to think about science that I think is important is as a tool. I'm not trying to preach anti-science or to say that science has no benefit at all for humanity. There are benefits. But just like tools have benefits, a hammer has a benefit, a screwdriver has a benefit, a vacuum cleaner has a benefit, but you're not going to theorize and think about the universe and knowledge as a whole on the basis of a hammer. Hammer is a tool. It will help you solve a very specific kind of problem, and then for other problems you have a different tool. And when we look at the sciences, this is actually the way it is, because biology is very different in its methodology, in the way that it addresses questions, the types of questions that it addresses, the kind of research that it does, this kind of statistical analysis that it does, than theoretical physics. And theoretical physics is very different than experimental physics, and experimental physics is very different from chemistry, organic versus non-organic. These are all big differences. And it's not clear how these are all part of the same view or understanding of the world. And in fact, scientists and philosophers of science and historians of science have had had a very difficult time trying to explain how all of these very different theories can all be considered science. Well, what is science? Like, what is specific about the quote-unquote scientific method that makes it scientific? This is an unresolved question. It's an unresolved question within philosophy and within science itself. And when we look at the history of science, there isn't a method. There isn't one uniform way to go about making discoveries and understanding different phenomena. How I interpret this is that, yeah, of course, these are different tools. And they have very limited applicability. They have very limited relevance outside of very specific issues and questions. So that's one way to understand science and to take it off of its pedestal and bring it down to size. And another thing to realize is that scientists themselves are not geniuses. We have this kind of view of scientists as being these brilliant people who understand so much. But I studied with physicists at Harvard. I had Nobel Prize winners as teachers, advisors, and I wouldn't characterize them as having wisdom. The kind of wisdom and knowledge that we see within our tradition, within our scholars, traditionally, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, so on and so forth. Those were geniuses. If you compare them to Stephen Hawking or Albert Einstein or any of these other geniuses that are considered today, there's no comparison. They don't have wisdom. They don't have that understanding that comes only from revelation, only from Allah. Allah is the only source of knowledge about the world, the reality. So we have to keep this in mind. The way to think about someone like Stephen Hawking is as a savant. Do you know the word savant? Savants are people who are very specialized and good at a specific thing. Like a savant, a chess-playing savant. He's a master of chess, the game of chess. And he can play 50 people at the same time because his mind just is so fast and powerful when it comes to chess. Do we call someone who is a master of chess like a genius who understands the world and who can give us deeper insights about who we are? No. Or someone who is like a savant at video games. Okay? Call of Duty or whatever game. Okay? No, they're brilliant masters at that one particular thing. And that one particular thing is just a game. It's just has very limited applicability. So again, we have to take science off of its pedestal and stop portraying it as the answer to questions of how the world works. Now let's get specifically to evolution, and I've said that we need to embrace the conflict between science and revelation. One thing that helps me understand how evolutionary theory itself is preposterous. The thing about evolution is that people have a hard time seeing what's wrong with it because it deals with such big numbers. It kind of seems to make sense, like, okay, if you have like a hot soup, over millions and millions of years, it's going to turn into a human being. Just purely through random processes. That's the theory of evolution. You have organic matter that, over millions and millions of years, becomes an organism. And then that organism evolves and becomes a human being. And the problem with that is that people don't have a sense of scale. Like, okay, I guess I can't really tell the difference between a million and a billion. They both seem big. I guess it makes sense. But here's the image that really helps me get a grasp of the numbers. So think about the most advanced technology that human beings have. Most advanced technology that human beings have. Is it an iPhone? Any iPhone? Apple fanboys? Or think about the International Space Station. Or think about the Large Hadron Collider, which is a particle accelerator that took over a decade to build. So would it make sense to say after a million years, a Large Hadron Collider like that technology, or the International Space Station, after a million or 100 million years, it can just through random processes self-generate? I guess, yeah, okay, let's just say that is possible. But the thing about that is that the International Space Station, or the most advanced piece of technology, human beings, using engineering and using their understanding, were able to create that technology over 10 years of development. say. Using conscious planning and engineering and organizing, they were able to build a 747 jet, the International Space Station, the Large Hadron Collider. But humans haven't been able to build even the smallest cell. All of the world's scientists and the most brilliant minds coming together and collaborating with all of the money at their disposal, all the resources at their disposal, could not create a single cell. And don't take my word for it. This is something that's acknowledged by synthetic chemists. And there's one brilliant synthetic chemist named James Tour, and he explains this. He's a synthetic chemist, meaning he builds chemicals in the lab from simpler chemicals. And he has this great video on YouTube. I highly recommend you watch it. He also has a paper explaining this. It is incredibly, incredibly difficult even to generate the smallest organic proteins. It is extremely difficult, and it requires a lot of money and concentrated effort to be able to do that. And that's just like the tiniest building block of what a cell is. So all of the world's most intelligent people coming together with unlimited resources couldn't even produce a cell. But they can produce all kinds of advanced technology that we see in the world today. So do you understand like the comparison here? Within a conscious process, we can produce technology, but a random process producing technology seems far-fetched. And at most, we might say, okay, over 1 million years or 100 million years, an iPhone could just arise from the dust, or the International Space Station, or a Mercedes-Benz could just be created by a pure random chance. But that's something that humans can easily are able to build. Things like a cell are much more difficult. How can we think that within 100 million years, something like that would be able to be produced without any conscious, intelligent creation? And just 2 more points, and I'll conclude, inshallah. Another really brilliant critique of evolution that I want to explain to you comes from a philosopher named Alvin Plantinga. He's actually a Christian. And he writes that everything about a human being you have to explain in evolutionary terms if you accept evolution. So why are our hands like this? Why is the human head like this? Why do we have 2 eyes? Why do we have 2 ears? Explain our beliefs. How did our ability to understand the world, how did our ability to understand what's true and what's false, how did that ability evolve? This is his question. And his point is that you can be a very successful species, meaning you can be very adaptive and you can spread your genes by having false beliefs. By having false beliefs. So you all know the idea of survival of the fittest. Whatever is the most fit to its environment will survive and reproduce, and this is how evolution works. This is called natural selection. So Plantinga says, how do our beliefs evolve, and how does our ability to tell truth from falsehood evolve? Because an animal with false beliefs, for example, imagine a tiger, or imagine a caveman, a Neanderthal. And this Neanderthal believes that tigers are friendly. Tigers are friendly. But he believes that the best way to go touch a tiger is to run in the opposite direction. This is his belief. It's crazy. He believes because of some mutation that tigers are friendly, and the best way to touch a tiger is to run as fast as you can in the opposite direction. Is he going to survive? Yes, he's going to be able to survive and outrun tigers and stay away from predators. But he has a completely false belief. He has a completely false belief about the world, because tigers are not friendly. They're predators, and the best way to go to a tiger is to approach it, not to run away from it. So the false belief is evolving, or the false belief is spreading because it's adaptive. So his point, Plantinga's point, is that our beliefs and our ability to tell truth and falsehood cannot evolve, because falsehood is just as adaptive as truth. And then what that means is that if we believe that evolutionary theory is right, then our belief that it's true undermines itself. Because how do we know that evolution is correct if our ability to tell truth and falsehood is corrupted or hasn't arisen through evolutionary processes? So he's showing logically how evolution undermines itself. Evolution undermines itself. So this is also a very powerful critique. And then one last thing, I wanted to mention intelligent design as something that Muslims can pursue, and as another example of scientists or people who are engaged and are aware of the biological sciences who are critiquing evolution and are saying that evolution is an unsatisfactory explanation for humanity and for life and all of these questions. And they're pointing out that if we look at life and we look at the details of biology, there's no way that this could have come about through random evolutionary processes. And this is their conclusion based on their research. I think Muslims can pursue that research as well and contribute to it. I know that Shaykh Mustafa is going to touch on this as well, inshallah. Okay, let's save the questions for after Shaykh Mustafa is also gone.
I think it is critical that we have lots of children here to go to school, to learn about evolution. What is Islam's point of view about evolution? What can these kids, what can you tell them to convince them that this evolution is right?
Yeah, we can answer that after, inshallah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah wa ba'd. So my talk is somewhat related. The topic is about atheism specifically. So a quick personal story. So when I was young, I grew up in a Muslim family. We weren't that practicing, but we used to attend Friday prayer most of the time. And I was one of those kids who used to ask a lot of questions and didn't always get the best answers, or wasn't always allowed to ask those questions. But when I got to college, one of my first classes that I took was a philosophy class on critical thinking. And my professor was an atheist. And I walked into that class thinking that pretty much everyone in my high school believed in God, whether they were Muslim or Jew or Christian or whatever else. Pretty much my assumption was that most people believed in God until I went into that class. And the professor himself was an atheist, and one day he asked a question. He said, how many of you still believe in Santa Claus? You know, and then people started raising no one raised their hands, right, for Santa Claus. He goes, how many of you still believe in the Tooth Fairy? He goes, you guys outgrew that belief, right? And then he asked, how many of you still believe in God? And I raised my hand, and there was this one other fundamentalist Christian who raised his hand, kind of a weird-looking guy. He's a missionary, a little bit socially awkward, and nobody else in the class raised their hand. Perhaps because they were intimidated by the professor, or perhaps because they were genuinely confused, or they don't want to, they didn't know anything about their parents' religion. And the rest of that entire class was something which, in short, destroyed my faith and caused me to leave Islam and become an atheist. So this is a very personal topic for me, because it's a journey that I went through myself. And then, alhamdulillah, I came back to Islam. And that's a long story in and of itself. But the reason why I'm mentioning that in the beginning is that oftentimes there's a lot of people who, if they've never encountered a lot of people who are atheists, or they deny and say we don't believe in God at all, their assumption is like that they're not there, or that they don't exist, or that this is not really an important topic. It's really not something that's affecting our community. But the reality is it's there. It exists. Whether people talk about it or they don't talk about it, it does exist and it affects us. So let me give you some statistics. The last major survey, one of the surveys from 2012, talks about the top practiced religions in the world. Okay, this is from adherence.com, and statistics, you always have to take them with a grain of salt, but they're good approximations. So they said that Christianity has 2.4 billion adherents or followers. That's about 33% of the world's population in 2012. Islam, 1.8 billion people, which is 24% of the world's population. And the third largest religion in the world after Christianity and Islam is the secular, non-religious, agnostic, or atheist, all thrown in one category. There's 1.2 billion people in that category, 16%. Larger than Hinduism, larger than Buddhism, much larger than Judaism, much larger than Sikhism and all the other religions that are out there. So what that means, and they also say that if you count this as a religion, meaning leaving, so if you take this as a religion, meaning not having a religion, marking yourself as none in a checkbox or something like that, then what we realize is that this is the third largest religion in the world, and it's actually the fastest growing religion in the world. In terms of the number of people who are leaving the religion that they may have followed and they're going into this camp. Now, just a word of caution here, the vast majority of people in this category, because they grouped everyone together, secular, non-religious, agnostic, atheist, the majority are agnostic. Overwhelming majority are agnostic, and the minority are atheist. And there's a little difference between these categories. Agnostic are people who say that we really don't know. We don't know if there's a God or not. And usually, people are just too busy doing other things, entertaining themselves to try and come up with an answer to that, or they're just too lazy to read, or try and figure something out. So most people fall in the agnostic category, I don't know, and oftentimes say, I don't care. Atheists are those who say, I know and I truly believe that there is no God. That's what an atheist is. But to give you a little sense of where atheists reside, right? There's a large population of secular, non-religious, agnostic atheists. If you put them all in one category, people who basically say no religion at all. No religion and God, either we don't care or we don't know, right? Or we say that He's not there. The top 15 countries, just to show you, those who have greater than 50% population of non-religious people is Estonia, Czech Republic, Japan, Denmark, Sweden, Vietnam, Macau, Hong Kong, France, and Norway. Right? And the ones who are in the 40%, China, Netherlands, Finland, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. Right? So these are large populations. We're talking about 40% or more. 15 countries. Some of them are very prominent countries where their populations, even though they may have a background in Christianity, you may drive around the country and you'll see churches all over the place. Those churches are all empty. Nobody's attending those churches. Those are just historical buildings that are just there for architectural, historical preservation purposes. So this is something which is growing. People's questioning belief that there is a creator who actually made everything in the world is growing. So it's important for us to understand that from the beginning. Now, a few points I'll bring up. One of the reasons why people fall into this religion, you can say, is that many people, they'll grow up, and when you ask them, why do you believe the religion that you're on, even Muslims, you say, why do you believe the religion? They'll say, well, that's what my parents taught me, or that's just, that's what I was taught. And when people challenge them, say, well, you just believe it for that reason, if they don't have a good answer, or they're not taught a decent answer, it starts to make them question. This is something which the Quran addresses. The Quran addresses the idea of blind belief. And it says that should not be the default position for anyone who's believing in Islam. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran in Surah Al-Baqarah, He says, وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمُ اتَّبِعُوا مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ. It says, when it is said to them, follow what Allah has revealed, meaning the truth. These people, what do they say? قَالُوا بَلْ نَتَّبِعُ مَا أَلْفَيْنَا عَلَيْهِ آبَاءَنَا. We follow what our forefathers used to follow. I mean, that's sufficient as an argument. And the Quran's response is, أَوَلَوْ كَانَ آبَاؤُهُمْ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ شَيْئًا وَلَا يَهْتَدُونَ. It says, the response is, what if your forefathers, they didn't understand anything, or they were not correctly guided? What if they were not on the truth? Is it sufficient for you to simply say, I just follow what I believe? So the Quran is teaching something very different, whereas many people of different religions, they teach that you have to have like this leap of faith and not rationalize, understand, why you believe what you believe. And it's very important for people to understand that. So there's a perception among many people that people who are religious, regardless of what religion they're following, they have like this blind faith. And they don't have any reasons for believing what they believe. There's a perception. It may not be reality. It may be reality for some people and not for others. But the perception is there and the propaganda is there that says these people are backwards and they don't really know what they're saying and all of that. So that's problematic. And it's very important for us to have a strong, rational foundation for our belief. Rational not in the sense of reason that Daniel was mentioning with the Muslim philosophers of the past, but rational in the sense that you have good reasons for believing, and there's very good reasons for having that. Right? So we'll talk about that in a moment. The second thing is that one of the challenges that people will encounter is that what is the default position? Right? If you're in high school and your friend comes and asks you, you say, oh, you believe in God? You say, yeah, I believe in God. Oh, well, what's your proof that God exists? The average middle schooler or high schooler, they don't know exactly what the response is unless they have a good education. Right? So their response is like, well, everyone believes in God. They may say that, and that's an answer, but no, they may say something else, and they say, well, the friend may come along and say, well, until you prove to me that God exists, I will not believe it. I don't believe that there's a creator until you show me the proof, the evidence. Where's the evidence? So basically what they're saying is that the burden of proof is on you because you believe in God. Why? Because you're making the claim. We're not making a claim for anything. We're denying the claim. All the burden of proof lies on you. The problem with this, there's two problems with this. Problem number one is this is not how reality functions. Okay, so there's Dr. Ja'far Shaykh Idris, one of the scholars, a very amazing philosopher, amazing scholar. He says this is a wrong analogy and it's a wrong way of looking at it. You're the accuser and there's the accused. There's like basically someone is guilty or innocent before proven guilty, right? Unless you have proof some evidence against them. And he says this analogy is wrong. The burden of proof doesn't just lie on the person who's believing in God. He says, look at another scenario. If you walk into a crime scene and you see that there's a dead person on the floor, and you're a detective, and I'm a detective, and we're both looking at this, and we're trying to figure out, okay, there's a gun on the floor, there's a bullet hole inside the wall, the glass is open, okay, we're detectives, and we go and look, we're trying to figure out what caused this death to happen. Was it a murder? Or was it a suicide? Or, what happened? So you come up with a theory, and you say, well, my theory is, as an investigator, well, the door seems to be open, there seems to be a bullet coming this way, there seems to be a footprint over here, and you say, you know what, my theory is, this person was murdered, and this is not a suicide. And the other detective comes along and says, no, I don't reject that theory. You haven't given me enough proof. You say, okay, well, what's your theory? What's your explanation for this? So I don't need an explanation. The burden of proof is on you. You need to show me more proof because I'm not convinced as to what you're saying. But the reality is that you can't just reject something like that. You have to offer an alternative theory. Why? Because you're standing in the middle of a crime scene. You're standing and there's a dead body there, and there's a gun there, and your job is to sit there and give an explanation. You cannot simply say, I don't like your explanation, but I will offer no counter explanation whatsoever. And this is a very good analogy for belief in a creator. Why? Because this world exists, and we see everything around us. Right? We measure it. We see the mountains and the trees and the human beings and people walking and thinking and doing all of these things. You need an explanation. You're offering an explanation for why all of this exists the way that it exists. So you're saying, you know what? I believe that all of this was created by a superior intelligence, which we call God. That's my explanation. If someone comes along and says, well, that's not enough proof for me. Show me your proof. You have to show me in detail what your proof is. So you have to ask them, what is your alternative explanation? So, I'm the one I don't have to provide any evidence. Right? All the burden of proof is on you. Not really. That's not the way this scenario works. The fact that you exist in the world and you're seeing the world and you're living in this world and you're observing all of these things, you're offering an explanation for why things are the way they are. If someone wants to reject that, they have to provide an alternative explanation. So the burden of proof, according to Dr. Ja'far, is not just on one side. There's two explanations, and you can't say one is on the other side. So that's one way of looking at it. And this is important because a lot of Muslims, they go to school and they're like, of course, we believe in a creator because of all this. And you have some people coming to them and challenging them and saying, you know what, no, I don't accept that. You have to show me proof. Where's the proof? Show me something. So they'll show them okay, let me show you the linguistic miracle of the Quran or something like that, which is cool and good, but that's not necessarily what you need to show them talking about proof for belief in a creator or an intelligent designer. There's another thing though. In fact, it's been argued strongly that the burden of proof is actually on the atheist. Right? And the reason why that is because the human mind, the way that it's constructed, is actually naturally inclined to look at something that's so complex, like this world in which we live, and say that there must have been a designer for this design that we perceive. And this is interesting because this research is coming out of universities where the majority of researchers in that department are probably agnostics or atheists. So I'm pretty much going to be quoting, for the most part, people who are either non-religious or they're atheists or avowed agnostics for most of this research here. So, there was a study done in 2011 by Oxford University, and this is one of the largest studies of its kind. There were 57 researchers who conducted 40 separate studies across 20 different countries. Right? So a very diverse range of different cultures and backgrounds. And in the conclusion, what they found was, they said that belief in God is something that is actually natural to the human mind. It's just natural. So one of the people who was part of that study was Dr. Justin Barrett. Doesn't believe in God, but he still admits, he writes, he's part of the Center for Anthropology and Mind. And anyone pretty much in the anthropology department is pretty much going to be an atheist or an agnostic. It's very rare to find people in the field of anthropology. And if you take a class on anthropology, you probably have your faith challenged significantly. So you should think about before enrolling into one of those courses. So he says, the preponderance of scientific evidence for the past 10 years or so has shown a predisposition to see the natural world as designed and purposeful, and that some kind of intelligent being is behind that purpose. So he summarizes what he's saying. Okay? He says, if we threw a handful of people on an island and they raised themselves, he says, I think that they would end up believing in God. If they were just left without any propaganda, any programming and all of that stuff, they would probably believe in God. Why? Because everything they see and they perceive, the human mind believes in this, perceives this cause and effect and wants to, attribute, how did all of this come about? And naturally, the natural conclusion is this was designed by some intellectual, superior, intellect. So that's what he says. Then you have Professor Pascal Boyer, who's an anthropologist again at Washington University, most likely an atheist or an agnostic himself. He says, religious thinking seems to be the path of least resistance for our cognitive systems. Meaning it's the believing in God, pretty much, is something that just comes natural to the human mind. And then he goes, by contrast, disbelief is generally the work of deliberate, effortful work are natural cognitive dispositions, hardly the easiest ideology to propagate. It's very difficult to spread atheism because it's so hard for people to actually process that, because it goes against what you're naturally inclined to be thinking about something in the first place. So you can make an argument that the burden of proof is actually on the atheist. Why? Because the human mind perceives things this way. Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi, one of the great early scholars, I think he was around 7th or 8th century, something like that, he said, even a child understands this. So if you stand behind a rock, right, and you're hiding somewhere, you take a little pebble and you throw it near a child, right, and it lands. The child is going to look around and start wondering, where did this rock come from? Because their perception is there in cause and effect. The child is not going to be like, I wonder, maybe just all of a sudden, all of the particles in that rock somehow randomly happen to move, hit me in the back, and then randomly move back, on the other side. That doesn't really happen. No, even children understand it. Of course, there's some very famous atheists today, like Richard Dawkins, who believes actually the opposite. So Richard Dawkins is a very famous, infamous atheist professor in the UK. He's written several books. Many people have stopped believing in God because of him. And he actually says in one of his books, he says, you know what, if somebody sees a miracle happening, like they see like a statue waving to them, he's talking against Christians. He says, you should not believe that it's a miracle. He says, because there's a possibility that all of the atoms of the statue's hand somehow moved in exactly the same time towards one direction and then moved back. And he says, look, I know it's a very unlikely possibility, but scientifically that's what we have to believe. And that's what you should believe. Right? Now that's not, it's arguable whether that's science or not, right? So this is something that human beings naturally understand from the get-go. Okay? And that's why atheists have always been a minority of a minority throughout history. In fact, most of the verses of the Quran, they don't directly address atheists as much as they address people who are associating partners with Allah. And the reason why, and they do address it, it's addressed in the Quran, but it's not addressed as much. Why? Probably because for most people, belief in God is something quite natural. Now, how is it established and how do we understand it today, particularly with the knowledge that we have about the world? Well, there's the concept of design. Right? Daniel mentioned intelligent design. So what design basically means is that things they exist in a particular way rather than existing in all the other potential ways in which they could have existed. And that's what we talk about with design. So Allah says in the Quran, says, surely we have created each and everything by a precise measure. Meaning everything has been created in a particular way which has a specific measure or a specific plan, you can say. There's proportions, balance that exists within it that is particular for a specific way. What is the opposite of design? The opposite of design is called chaos. Chaos is a theory. Basically, chaos is something that has no rules. There's no rules, there's no order, there's no purpose that you can perceive that exists in those things. So if we look at this world in which we live, and you look at all the connections and how things are interrelated, you'll realize that all of these things exist in a particular way. Let me give you a simple example. If you look at heat, right? If you want to warm your food, just think of a very primitive society, okay? You want to warm your food, and you're trying to light a fire. What's going to happen if one day you try to ignite a spark, and you're trying to light a fire, and one day it ignites a fire, a spark comes out. The next time you try to make a spark, and something freezes. The next day you try it again, it explodes. The next day you try it again, and some flower comes out or something weird. There's no consistency in the world at all. You would not be able to live. You would not be able to survive because you don't know what to do. You drink water one day and it quenches your thirst. The next day you drink the exact same thing, no change whatsoever, and now all of a sudden it's poison that kills you. How would you would not know what to do? So that's what Allah is mentioning in the Quran, that everything has been created with a specific measure, meaning for a specific purpose. And Allah mentions that in the Quran. He says, you do not see any fault or incongruity in the creation of Ar-Rahman, of the All-Merciful. And it says, look again. Can you see any rifts? I mean, can you see anything that's messed up in a way that shouldn't be there? Right? So that specific order, which was designed for a purpose, is not going to be violated. So when we understand that, and when we reflect upon that, there's been a lot of new experiments and observations that have actually give us a better understanding of certain aspects of our world and how these things function. So let's take one example of a manifestation of something that appears to be designed in this world. So every living thing in this world is composed of atoms. And in those atoms, there's certain particles that exist. And if you look at the human body, does anybody know how many cells are in your human body? There's cells in all living things, right? How many cells are in your human body? Does anyone know? Approximately? Huh? 3,600 cells? A lot more cells. That would be very problematic. A good guess, but that would be very problematic. We scratch off our skin cells and then we'd be in trouble. Does anyone have an idea? There's 100 trillion cells. Okay? 100 trillion cells in our body. And how many atoms are in each human cell? 100 trillion. So 100 trillion atoms in a cell and 100 trillion cells in the human body, right? So if you think about that, right, if there was some imbalance in those cells and they weren't ordered and structured in a particular way, the human body would not be functioning the way that it does. But there's a specific order, there's a specific balance, there's a specific structure there, right? So what does that do? That indicates a certain amount of planning, a certain amount of purpose that exists, right? Now that's just the things that we know about in a more complex state. If you look at it look at what did the Arabs 1,400 years ago in the desert know, right? Or, I mean, okay, maybe not the desert. Arab philosophers in the Middle Ages, what did they know? They knew about the planets, they knew about the earth. I mean, they knew how, if our planet Earth was a little bit closer to the sun, what would happen? If it wasn't in the perfect balance that it's in, we'd all burn up and die. If it was just a little bit further, what would happen? We'd all freeze and we'd die. The fact that we exist and we're able to breathe and we're not burning up and our planet happens to be exactly the perfect distance from the sun and is spinning in a particular way and gravity is causing us to not have the earth spin off in some other direction to cause us to not be able to regulate our temperature. The fact that we have an ozone, the atmospheric layer which is preventing the sun's rays from coming and burning up our skin, all of these things are in a perfect balance, right? They're in a balance from the functioning existence of life. So now, when we look at all of these things, we can look at so many things, from the digestive system, we can look at this, the immune system of a human being, we can look at so many different processes. At the end of it all comes down to two explanations. Either all of these things, the 100 trillion cells in the human body, exactly our distance from Earth to the sun, the fact that we have an atmosphere that's protecting us from burning up, either all of this is a result of chance, meaning it's just a coincidence. All of it just kind of happened to be in exactly the perfect place at the right time, or it was actually designed with a purpose. And if it's designed with a purpose, that means that there has to have been something that has the knowledge and the power and the wisdom to design it in this particular way. So how do you go between these two? How do you decide between these two options? These are pretty much the two options when it comes down to the idea of atheism. Most people who are atheists, they say that this world is a product of chance. That we as human beings were a product of chance. That our universe or multiverse or whatever it may be, where everything just happened to be a coincidence. And they say, we know it's a very low probability, right? We're like the winning the lottery, Lottery is very difficult to win, but people do win the lottery. They say, well, we believe that everything exists the way it exists because it just happened to be that way. It was just a coincidence that all of this happened. Now, first of all, let's just say we didn't have any other information. We didn't have any other knowledge about anything that I'm about to present to you. Basically, what it's coming down to is that the belief that all of this happened through a particular design is like 99% or more. But the belief that it was just a coincidence is like 1%. Right? Even if we didn't have all the up-to-date experiments and everything else, which I'm about to tell you right now, still, if someone wants to believe something is like 1%, likely to have been true versus 99%, is that how people make their decisions? Like if someone is going like, you know what, I'm going to decide between going down this road, which has a 99% chance of getting me to my destination, or this other road, which has a 1% chance of getting me to my destination. I think I'll go with the 1%. People don't make decisions like that. People decide based upon what is the more likelihood, unless they have some other reason to not want to accept that thing. And that's what atheism is going to come down to. Okay? But we don't really need to even worry about that anymore because we know certain things. We know certain things about mathematical impossibilities or improbabilities, you can say. So probabilities in mathematics are calculated in a particular way. I'm going to give you a very quick review. Okay? If you take 10 marbles and you label each one 1 through 10, you throw them in a bag. Okay? What is the probability that I'm going to randomly pull out the number 3 on the first try? 10%, right? 1 in 10. Okay, so 10% chance, I'll pull out the number 3. Okay? If I'm going to say, okay, you know what? I'm going to pull out the number 1 2 times in a row, or the number 3, let's say. I'm going to pull out the number 3 2 times in a row. What's the probability of that? 1%. There's 1 chance in 100. You go 10 multiplied by 10. You add. You don't add, you multiply, right? So you get 1 in 100 possibility, right? So what's going to happen is, what's the probability that you're going to draw out the number 3 10 times in a row? 1 in how many times?
100 billion.
Yeah. 1 in 10 to the 10th power. Excellent. So 1 in 10 billion chances. Right? 1 in 10 billion chances. So now, if you ask yourself, or if you ask a scientist, that, okay, we have these human cells that exist within us. Within the cells, there are proteins that actually help form that human cell. Right? So we have, if we say, let's just say all of this randomly formed by chance. We know that there are 92 elements from the periodic table, when you take chemistry. There's 92 elements that are found in nature. And you need to have 5 specific elements necessary for life to combine in exactly the right measure to form one protein molecule, which is going to eventually have other processes to make one cell. So there was a Swiss mathematician, Charles Eugene Guy. He calculated the probability of this happening. So he said, look, if you take into consideration the quantity of matter that exists in the entire world and the time that would be needed for this to actually come about, the probability of a chance formation of one protein, which is necessary to make life, not a cell, just one of the proteins, is 1 in 10 to the 160th power. So what is 10 to, again, it's hard to visualize this, right? Oh, it's just a large number. Okay. 10 to the 160th power basically means, a million is 10 to the 6th power, so 6 zeros. 9 zeros is a billion, right? So this is a number with 1, and you got 160 zeros after it. There's no name for that number that no one really knows what it is, probably. So that's a really, very, very low probability chance that that's actually ever going to happen. And that's just one small step in order to actually, produce one human cell. Now, the thing is, what's more interesting is that some people, they still believe, they say, you know what, no, I still believe that this could happen by chance. I still believe that. Why do they believe that? They said, well, if we try enough times, and there's enough people working on it daily, randomly, so they say, people are like, well, computers can process things so quickly, and we can churn out all of these numbers, so there must be a way that you can get to this number. This is the common response of most people who are agnostic or atheists who don't believe in a creator. They'll say, well, you can make an argument And this argument is an old argument. This argument was made by Julian Huxley, who was a big proponent of Darwinism. He made this argument a long time ago, and he basically said, it's called the monkey theorem. He said if you put a bunch of monkeys inside of a room and they're typing on typewriters, right? Imagine computers now, right? They're banging on the keyboard randomly. He says, after a while, you will eventually get a sonnet of Shakespeare produced with one of them. Because if you have enough random combinations, if you randomly just push a bunch of buttons on the keyboard, eventually you're going to get a word. Eventually you're going to get a sentence. And you keep going for a very long period of time, eventually it's going to happen. So the argument that's being made is that if these chemicals keep trying to combine randomly and just form by chance, if it happens enough times, then eventually one time they're going to get it right. And this is a very common argument you're going to encounter. If you go to a university, most professors will make this argument, and this is probably the most common refutation or response to the idea of intelligent design. The problem is, it's false. And the reason why it's false is because they actually did an experiment in the UK recently, and they said, okay, let's go ahead and put a bunch of monkeys, just for the joke of it, put a bunch of monkeys inside of a cage on computers with the keyboard, and let them bang around and do it and all of this stuff. So they did that, and they let them hit around the keyboard and everything. The monkeys were kind of like, using the computer as a toilet as well. But other than that, they were, doing all of this, and they're recording everything that the monkeys are doing, just for the sake of it, checking the experiment. And what did they find? After 1 month of having this done, for the entire time, the monkey did not even produce one word. Not one English word. Now what are the shortest words in the English language? I, A, right? One letter. They could not produce one. Why? Because you have to have a space before the I, or at least if you start with the I, you have to have a space after the I, or a space after the A and before the A, or unless it's capital in the beginning. They could not get one word. Right? So what happened was they said, okay, this argument that they can produce a Shakespeare sonnet, a Shakespeare sonnet is 488 letters per page. If they were randomly going to come up with this and somehow try to get it, the probability of this is 26 multiplied itself by 488 times. So 26 to the 488 power. In base 10, that's 10 to the 960th power. Just to produce one page of Shakespeare's sonnet. Okay? Now, if you think about that, the number of particles in the universe that we know of is 10 to the 80th power. That's the number of particles that we know. So what they said was, the probability of this actually happening, as has been argued, is so slight that it's actually impossible. If you took the whole universe, thinking about how many particles there are, and we convert every single one of the particles into a computer chip, and the computer chip is processing at a maximum speed random calculations, you would still not be able to produce one sonnet of Shakespeare. Let alone a cell, let alone a protein that's going to somehow eventually produce a cell. So that's really important to understand that. So that argument has been completely destroyed, meaning believing in coincidence, knowing what we know about the world and the universe, at least based upon our current knowledge, it's almost no one can actually argue that this is something that you can technically believe in. And that's kind of what the argument that was being presented before, is that someone said, look, to put it in layman's terms, okay, if somebody showed you an airplane, 747 jet, okay, and they say this was assembled because there was this tornado, it started moving really fast, and it went through a junkyard, and there was a bunch of metal scraps and stuff like that, and all of a sudden the tornado picked up all of these parts and randomly assembled it into this airplane. Most people would not believe that. And someone comes along and says, well, if there was enough tornadoes and enough chances and enough potential times that just kept on happening, which doesn't happen in nature, by the way, it doesn't just keep on repeating itself. But even if it did, the probability that it would be somehow produced randomly like this is virtually impossible, if not impossible. Right? So this is one of the major reasons why people end up in atheism, because they're not aware of how to process these type of probabilities. The last thing, and I'll conclude with this, and I'll just spend a little bit of time on this. Most people in the world who are agnostic, their problem is not so much believing that there is an intelligent creator. In fact, most people, I mentioned the statistic really high, right? People are agnostic atheists, over 1 billion people. Most people are upset by a religion or religious people that they've encountered. There's emotional trauma that's there. They've had a bad experience with people trying to push their ideas on them or treating them bad or whatever it may be. So there's an emotional component there. And one of the other emotional components, which is a mix of emotional and intellectual argument, but I'd say it's more emotional than intellectual, is the argument that if God existed and that there was an intelligent designer and creator, then there wouldn't be all of these bad things happening in the world. Right? And the problem with the argument is it's a fallacy, actually. Because the idea is that, if God knows everything, if Allah knows everything, then, and if He's able to do everything, which is how we define Allah, which is how most people define God, well, why didn't He stop this bad thing from happening and this bad thing from happening? No, nothing bad will happen in the world. And a lot of people, this is what bothers them and what leads them to kind of start having doubts about Allah and all of that. Now the answer is long, but the short answer is that from the Islamic perspective, we are in this world because we're being tested. This is not our final abode. This is not paradise. So evil does exist. And yes, Allah set up the world so that bad things can happen. And sometimes He will stop them, and sometimes He will not stop them. And if Allah stopped every single bad thing from happening in every capacity, then there would not be a test. So if you're sitting there in a classroom, and your teacher gives you a test, an exam, right? And you're being tested from your perspective, you know that this is a test. And you're sitting there and you're struggling with one of the questions and you're just getting frustrated, you're getting upset. You're just like, you know what? You get upset at the teacher and you go, forget you. Why do you have to test me like this? I don't believe you exist. The conclusion doesn't make sense. The fact that you're being tested has nothing to do with the fact that a creator exists or doesn't exist. Right? So that's a problem, and people have issues with that, but Islam puts things into perspective for people and reminds us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us in order to be tested. He is still merciful. He does not test us more than our capacity. And in the things that happen in this world, there's always some good for the believer who can process it. Either they're going to be patient and they're going to be rewarded for that and they'll get paradise in the next life, or there's something that they will learn in this life from their experience, and they'll grow stronger, and they won't make the same mistakes again, and it'll help them in their life. There's always some underlying wisdom of why it exists. So the question is, what is the wisdom behind this evil? Not so much about why this bad thing somehow is going to lead me to disbelief in God. So inshallah, those are just some of the few things we wanted to cover, and we'll open it up to questions. Inshallah. So we have a lot of questions already that came in from the first presentation. I'm going to re-enable my internet, find out how many more questions came in. You have it open? I'll open it. Here we go. All right. You want to take some of these? Start from the top, I guess.
The top question is, hi, Osama the best.
Yes, so there's one with a hi.
Is what scientists say about height correct, or is the part incorrect? So, about the height of Adam alayhi salam. So there are hadith where the Prophet ﷺ describes the height of Adam as being, I forgot the exact number, 70 cubits. So what does science have to say about this? Well, this is, as was mentioned before, a clear conflict between what science claims is possible and what we find within hadith. I think our approach here is, again, if we recognize the limitation of science, we can take the words of the Prophet ﷺ for what they are. And I think that level of respect and love for the Prophet ﷺ and his words will guide us to take what he says, and within Sahih Hadith, in our tradition, and be able to interpret that and say, well, clearly the Prophet ﷺ knows and has been given knowledge that we don't have, and maybe we will never be able to see and verify, but we take what the Prophet ﷺ says at his word, and he's describing something that he knows and he has seen and we do not have access to. As far as like people's height, another aspect is like people's age. So within the Quran, different people are mentioned as having living to a very long life, over 900 years. Nuh alayhi salam, for example, or Khidr, or the Ashab al-Kahf, the youth of the cave. So a good way to understand it is that recently there have been animal species that live for centuries. So there was a recent discovery of a shark that lives in the Arctic called the Greenland shark. And the marine biologists verified that this shark has been living for over 450 years. Other species have been discovered, like fish and even reptiles that live for centuries, like tortoises, for example. A long time have been known as living over 200 years. So this tells us that there's no real logical reason why a human can't live to be such an age, and there's no logical reason why a person. Sure, we just hold it. Okay, then pass it. And there's no logical reason why a person can't live to be 1,000 years old. Biologically, it's possible. Now that's being acknowledged, and I don't think that it's logically impossible for humans that have been much, much taller than they are in their current state. There's also, I have a collection of articles that I've saved from reputable sources showing that there are many fossils that have been found of very large human-like skeletons. And the geologists discovering these don't know what to make of them, but they're actually very large in size and they appear to be a human. And some of them are even displayed in museums. And people, or skeletons as large as 10 feet or 11 feet. And this is part of the historical record, and it's not really addressed in the mainstream biological sources, but this is something that the documentation is there. If anyone is interested in seeing that, you can ask me about it. I also have it on my website, muslimskeptic.com. So I don't see any problem with taking this hadith at face value.
So yeah, with regards to the hadith, it's also important to understand that Muslim scholars have actually viewed the hadith differently. So there's two interpretations. One of them is that Adam was 70 cubits, and then human beings consistently decreased over time. So that's one reading of the hadith. That's not the only reading of the hadith among traditional scholars. So Imam Anwar Shah Kashmiri and some other scholars, they've said that the language here, basically what it means is that Adam was 70 cubits originally. When he came to earth, he was decreased, and then he's going to return back to the original state. So that is not constantly decreasing over time, but that his earthly existence was decreased, not that there's a gradual decrease taking place. So there are two interpretations, regardless of which one. I mean, either way, this is not really an issue. But it's important to realize that sometimes we need to understand the hadith in a proper manner before we decide whether there's even a conflict between science and what Islam says. Move to the next one. Evolution is a theory. How has it been accepted as reality, and why have Muslim scientists not made a bigger effort in proving this theory is false?
So I think why evolution has been accepted, I think that there's been a lot of promotion of evolutionary theory. And there is a lot of interesting books that have been written about how Charles Darwin actually was very heavily promoted by atheists beyond the merit of his actual work. And when The Origin of Species was published, the scientific community at that time had a lot of questions and didn't feel like he presented a very compelling case, because he didn't explain how diversity within a population of organisms could arise, because at that time they didn't have an understanding of genetics and genetic mutation. So Darwin's theory, as he wrote it, was incomplete within The Origin of Species. Nonetheless, people like Aldous Huxley and other non-scientists saw this as a great opportunity for atheists to finally have an answer to theists and to Christians and other believers, in saying that, okay, look, you asked us and you challenged us to explain why or how humanity and all of this design and all of this creation could have come from nothing. Well, here is an explanation. Darwin has explained it. This is showing how you can explain the origin of life and the diversity and complexity of life without appealing to a divine source. And so they jumped on this opportunity and they heavily promoted Darwinism, despite the lack of scientific merit that the theory actually had, because of the questions that Shaykh Mustafa and myself brought up. And that kind of ideological commitment to evolution is present today. Some of the most vocal proponents of evolution are not scientists. They're actually atheists, and they view this as a way to bash believers and show them that, oh look, you're irrational for thinking that the Bible or the Quran is literally true. And now we are more enlightened and we understand the true origins of all life and humanity. So there's a lot of bias, there's a lot of propaganda, exaggeration. There's a very interesting book called What Darwin Got Wrong. It's written by an atheist named Jerry Fodor. And in this book, Fodor is an atheist. He critiques evolutionary theory and Darwinism in particular, and he describes in the introduction of his book that in writing the book, many of his academic colleagues approached him and said, don't write this book. We don't have any problems with your conclusions. We understand that you're raising actually legitimate criticisms of evolutionary theory, but don't write this because you're giving ammo to religious people. And so this was kind of a glimpse of what happens behind the scenes at academic institutions. So there's a very big bias in academia against religion and in favor of evolutionary theory, and that's why it has enjoyed the kind of promotion and prominence that it has over the decades.
Inshallah, we'll take 3 more questions. Inshallah, I'll just pick 3 random ones, inshallah. Who designs the designer?
Short answer is no one.
If the burden of proof is on the atheist, does not the theory of evolution give them that argument?
I'll let you know, inshallah. So the answer is no, it doesn't give them the argument, but they think it does. So the thing is, prior to, Richard Dawkins actually mentions, he says prior to Darwin, it was very difficult to be a rationally fulfilled atheist, because you don't have any explanation or mechanism to believe that all of this came about through some process. You can't explain things. So he says, post-Darwin, we can at least have an explanation or a response as to why all of this happened. The problem is, though, is that the more we understand the processes, the more we understand about the world, the more we believe that the idea of chance or random formation of everything coming together in order to form the complexity that we know in this world, the further and further we believe it's actually possible. So actually things have not changed. And what's happening is people are actually reversing their position. A very interesting example was Professor Anthony Flew. So one of the books that I was reading in that philosophy class that I mentioned to you, actually I'm reading outside of the class, additional reading for myself, was Anthony Flew, and I used to read his arguments on atheism. He's one of the reasons why I left Islam and became an atheist. What's really interesting is in 2008, he publicly declared and published a book that says he changed his mind after 50 years of being one of the world's most prominent atheist philosophers, that he switched and he says, you know what, I actually do believe in God now, because now I understand different arguments. I've revised my understanding of Darwinism, of evolution. I've been discussing with people for a very long time, and he reversed it. He wrote a really interesting book. It's called There Is a God, but it says on the cover, there is no God, and then the no has an X over it, and he changes it written in with the A, because he changed his mind. It's how the world's most notorious atheist changed his mind. So it's a really interesting read. And so people are changing over, realizing that it becomes more and more difficult the more we learn about the world to actually remain an intellectually fulfilled atheist.
According to scientific dating, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. How does Islam estimate the Earth? How old the Earth?
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
According to scientific dating, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. How old does Islam estimate the Earth to be?
So there's no conflict between anything within Quran and Sunnah and estimating scientific estimates claiming the age of the Earth at billions of years. So there's no estimate that we can derive from Revelation. There's no conflict there with what the current scientific consensus is. Allahu A'lam, we don't need to confirm it and say that it's for sure true or disconfirm it.
Okay.
There was one question that the brother asked before that I wanted to address. Like, what is the practical takeaway in terms of what we teach our kids about evolution? Because they're going to school, they're learning this, or what should be taught at Islamic schools? I think that it's important for Islamic schools to teach what is taught at other schools, just so that students are aware of what evolutionary theory is, because they'll definitely be exposed to it when they go to college. But then at the same time, bringing in resources from intelligent design specifically, and there are a lot of great books and material that has been written, from authors like Stephen Mayer, Michael Behe, for example, the Discovery Institute. They have a lot of very insightful work, and they follow academic standards. And I think that kind of material is great to expose Muslims to and introduce young Muslims to this critique of the status quo, critique of what is considered scientific consensus, so that inshallah they'll be able to produce their own work and contribute to that discussion in a way that's true to Islam.
I just have one quick Facebook question. Why can't we reference to verses that coincide with modern science in providing proof of God's message?
I didn't understand that question.
Me neither. Can we ask the question, why can't reference to verses that coincide with modern science in providing proof of God's message? I don't know. You guys
So I get the question. The question is, why can't we do what's called tafsir ilmi, basically looking at, trying to explain the Quran in light of science and say, oh, look at, what's an example? Like, how Allah describes al-qamar versus al-shams, and how this shows that the Quran is true because it's scientifically accurate. Al-shams means that which emits its own light, versus al-qamar is something that only reflects light, and that's true of the sun and the moon, and that's scientifically known. So this shows that the Quran is true. I think the problem with tafsir ilmi is that, again, you've put science on this pedestal as the judge of what is true and false. And so if you give science that kind of authority and that kind of power, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. Because there are other parts of the Quran that clearly contradict scientific consensus and scientific facts. So when you come across those ayat and come across those passages, then your faith is going to be questioned. And because science, who you've made the authority, says that that's false. So this is a recipe for disaster. It's just much intellectually safer and actually more intellectually consistent to have our yaqeen in the word of Allah and His Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's our grounding, that's our anchor. And then we judge other philosophies and other ideologies according to the Quran and Sunnah, because we put the haqq on that pedestal and judge everything else according to its standard.
Just make one quick concluding remark on that. So, not a concluding remark. Go ahead.
You know, the reason I say there's no conflict between Quran, Sunnah, and science, because science we are lacking a lot. وَمَا أَتِيتُ مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. So what we know now is very little, and as we learn more, we can see all this will fit. So the most important thing is the Quran and Sunnah. The science we are very lacking, but there's no conflict. Because maybe there's a conflict today, but tomorrow they'll find a theory that denies the first theory, and now we are in that the Quran is always right. So I think that's how I look at it. There's no conflict at all. The conflict is because science is never a conflict. We know very little. Thank you.
Okay, inshallah. So yeah, just my conclusion remarks based upon what Daniel was saying at the end is that when we're talking about the Quran and Sunnah, it's really important that we have a strong foundation of understanding our religion. So like this talk is not sufficient, for people to really exist in the modern world. And it's not just sufficient to just pick up a book of hadith and just read it on your own. So I would just strongly encourage each and every single one of you to really take Islamic education seriously, because we live in a world, we live in a society where people have many different ideologies, many different worldviews that are challenging the beliefs of Islam. And if we don't have a strong foundation, it's very easy to get sucked up into those things. So, quick advertisement, inshallah. So I have started a school about 6 years ago called California Islamic University. We have access to 22 online courses. We have one of our courses is on beliefs. It's about theology. And it tells you how to deal with these issues. How do we believe in Allah? Why do we believe in Allah? How do we respond to some of the arguments that are presented about free will, predestination, about why evil exists, all of those things. So if you're interested, you can check out our website, calislamic.com, or you can grab one of these little flyers from here, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair, Shaykh Mustafa Umar and Ustadh Haqiqatjou. We are very blessed to have you. Takbir. 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 Very, very quick announcements before we pray Salat al-Isha, inshallah. Next Saturday, inshallah, we have the continuation of our spiritual healing class, which will be at 7:15. Tomorrow actually will be a continuation, an open discussion, not necessarily a lecture, just open discussion on the topics discussed today with Ustadh Haqiqatjou, will be standing next day for middle school, high school, and college students, inshallah. That will be tomorrow at 7:15, open discussion with Ustadh Daniel. Next, inshallah, September 22nd will be our back to school Cups Sunday. So for kindergarten through 5th grade, we're going to have a program from 3:30 to 5:30 p.m. For kindergarten through 5th grade, inshallah, that will be September 22nd. September 29th is our annual fundraising dinner for the community night. We will have Ahmad al-Shukri here for that program, as well as Shaykh Muhammad Abbas. And October 27th will be our big Quran and Nasheed night, which will be October 27th, inshallah. If you have any questions or anything, please please feel free to come to us if you have any thoughts of topics that you want to be addressed at the community night. Please let us know, inshallah, and we'll take it into consideration. Again, jazakallah khair everybody for coming.